Hello, hello. Um, Hi, everyone. Welcome to a special Latino Conservation Week edition of Beyond Land Acknowledgements. Today, I'm very proud to have a friend and colleague and an advocate joining us, Caressa Nguyen. This is going to be a conversation on public lands with sacred lands, native hands. And Caressa, thank you so much, first of all, for joining us. I wanted to start off with a few brief words. So, Latino Outdoors would first like to recognize and excuse me would first like to recognize and acknowledge that we are joining today's live stream from traditional native lands from across the United States and around the world. Indigenous peoples maintain resiliency in their continuous fight for social justice, equity, and rematriation of lands. We here at Latino Outdoors are dedicated to providing opportunities of learning, unlearning, relearning, listening, and going beyond land acknowledgements. Caressa, thank you so much for joining us, and I'd like to start with introduction. If you would like to, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Caressa Nguyen, Mayon. Hi, everyone. My name is Caressa Nguyen. I'm a citizen of the Ione Band of Miwok Indians. We're from where Ione is located in the Sierra Nevada foothills of California, so about 40 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes outside of Sacramento. And so we are an organization based out of Sacramento.
Great, I appreciate that. So, getting to know Sacred Lands, Native Hands. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. And then also, thank you so much for the work you do with Sacred Lands, Native Hands. How did you get involved with the organization? What is the organization? What's your role?
So I'm the co-founder and president of Sacred Lands Native Hands. The organization, I was never one of those people whose life goal it was to start an organization. It really came out of necessity. I was at I do work in Indigenous food sovereignty, and so I was at a Starhawk's permaculture design training, and there I met a woman who lived in another part of the Sierras. She was from the East Coast originally, but she was sharing with me how she and her friend had all of this access to public lands, to private lands. And my tribe, I come from a landless tribe, and so that really informs my perspective and my approach. I'm always thinking of who the most marginalized voices are, because even though we're all tribal nations, we all have different circumstances. Some of us have economic development, some of us have land, and especially California, we are in a very unique, we have a unique, we're very unique from other tribes in the U.S. Because of our history of colonization, the mission system, being a Mexican territory, and also the unratified treaties. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, these all play a role in our current circumstances as tribal nations. And so my tribe is a tribe who was left landless. And so we came together to create a bridge between landowners and Indigenous peoples, because what I've been seeing in my community is a lack of access to land means that there is less opportunity for land practice to apply our traditional ecological knowledge. And we're faced with at the same time, we're faced with the climate crisis. So it is urgent. And that's how Sacred Lands was born.
I appreciate brief history, but overview about how you got involved with and brought on Sacred Lands Native Hands. So, what is the mission and the vision of the organization?
So, our mission is to restore ancestral homelands to the hands of Indigenous peoples for traditional stewardship, protection, and the perpetuation of a regenerative future. We also provide education on Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ecological knowledge to non-natives as well, because when forming Sacred Lands, I had a conversation with an elder, and one of the things that he said to me was that we need landowners, non-native, especially because they're the biggest landholders, to tend to the land in the way that it needs, um, and so we are an organization who strives to do that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and absolutely good point, like about who actually owns quote unquote these lands right now, and how do we have to work with them at this moment in time. Um, so, for folks who are watching or will be watching a recording of this conversation, can you share with us how Sacred Lands Native Hands works to restore homelands to the hands of Indigenous peoples?
Yes, so we are a new organization. We were only incorporated in 2020, August of 2020. And so we started off doing webinars. We did a series called Tending the Elements, providing education on traditional ecological knowledge. Um, um, and it was interesting. One of the people who we had on, she talked about fire, and she went to Chico State and had learned from one of my elders, who is a cultural practitioner, but he's also an academic. And she applies what she learned from that elder. She actually did a study abroad in Australia with him as well. Because he had lived in the bush for some time, with indigenous communities there, and um, there's a lot of work around restoring traditional fire practices in both California and Australia. And so she applied what she learned, or she applies what she learns in her job with a government agency. Um, and so there were a lot of government employees who were interested in the series, and that's important, to be applying traditional ecological knowledge across mainstream society. I would call it. Yeah, and we also, our ongoing campaign is land acquisition to reclaim Miwok lands, as I do come from a landless tribe, and although we were able to put land into trust for our first time um, in recent years, also in 2020, that land is for designated use. We still struggle, because we're landless. We still struggle with housing many of our tribal members, and we don't have economic development. So this land will be so the tribe's land will be used for specific purposes, but we still struggle to access places to apply our traditional knowledge and to gather land for cultural use. And so that is an ongoing campaign of ours, is land acquisition. And we also work on legislative campaigns for co-management, for tribal co-management.
That is so much that you all are doing with your organization, and really, I know that it's one of many that are taking on this work, and yet it's so important because you're able to touch on the community that that you know and that you're a part of, and affect change, kind of on a smaller level, while a lot of folks are tackling similar situations in their own communities.
Absolutely. And that's why we're specifically California serving, because California has 109 of the 574 federally recognized tribes that exist in the US. And so California holds an entire fifth of all tribes in the US. Yet a lot, but because our situation, our circumstances are different, we're often marginalized. And so that's who we seek to serve.
It's important work, and I appreciate you taking that on, and also the you being so open to the education process for all of those that might just be learning, and coming into these conversations or into this work, whether it's advocacy or through public lands or through quote unquote conservation. Um, can you share with us some information and knowledge about the Miwok people? You recently wrote a beautiful post where you said the Miwok creation story tells of our responsibility as human beings. We'd love to hear more about what that means to you as an advocate and as someone who works to tell stories and also work with the land through indigenous ecological knowledge.
Yes. So I feel very privileged, because growing up, I've never had to question whether I had purpose or not. Um, I've always had a strong sense of self and purpose. What that purpose looked like, that I was not as sure of that. However, in our Miwok creation story, we I'll share a little bit. But in the story, when humans were created, we were almost laughable because we depended on the other animals to live. We were seen as kind of helpless. But things happened, and um, and he, and it became that humans were to become a voice um, for certain animals, and and so in this work, that tells me my responsibility, that tells me our responsibility as human beings, and when addressing the climate crisis, indigenous ecological knowledge is that's why I say that indigenous ecological knowledge is critical to seriously addressing the climate crisis. Um, and so and so this work is really urgent. Um, we don't have a lot of time, and even looking out at the street, I currently live in an urban area. On these hot summer days, I look outside and it's eerie. People aren't walking around outside, and um, because it is so hot, and this is not the world that we want to live in. um, and so and so this work that we're doing in conservation, it is really important. And it is important that my tribe is at a point where we need land to continue practicing our ways, because um, and we have to fight to protect the delta, to protect our rivers, because I grew up in a village, or I grew up next to in an area where a lot of things are named Consumnes or Kasumne, and in Miwok that means place of salmon. um, However, it's anticipated that salmon in our rivers may go extinct by the end of the century. Um, and so, yeah, that's a little bit about Miwok people and how salmon is sacred to us, and the um, in the circumstances of the current situation of our lands for both native and non-natives.
I appreciate that, and you sharing that. I feel like through Latinidad also there's, well, that word, but
Mhm.
there is a through line in creation stories that ties in action to nature, uh, origins, um, and it is part of our culture to conserve and to care for the land.
Yes,
I'd
absolutely.
like to go ahead.
Oh no, go
So
ahead.
earlier, when we spoke on the phone earlier, you mentioned a few topics in relation to public lands and the history of public lands. And while public lands do reach from coast to coast, you had mentioned Yosemite in particular during our conversation. If it's all right with you, I'd like to touch on some of those topics in particular, and see how Yosemite can be used as an example of so many of these issues, past, present, and future. So, my question then is, um, how has the management and use of public lands evolved over time from an indigenous people's perspective?
Okay, so my tribe is Miwok. We're broken up into many small bands that span from. So I'm Northern Sierra Miwok. So we span from the Sacramento Valley down all the way into Yosemite National Park. The to Awani is the name for Yosemite Valley. There's also coastal Miwok who are across the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin, and and I believe they go north. And then there's Lake Miwok around Lake County, and so we're pretty big people as a whole, broken up into bands and traditionally villages, is how we would identify. And so public lands has impacted us tremendously. In my area in particular, our ceremonial house is located inside of a California state park. Um, I actually have a background in interpretation. I did interpretation at the Yosemite Museum, and did a lot of education there. So living there was kind of my it's never sat well with me that that we prayed inside of a California state park and were subject to their regulations, and had to even how we have to build our roundhouse. It has to be according to code. However, Yosemite is a unique situation in that it's really it's con- bad conservation policy is in your face. In a lot of my presentations, I show what Yosemite Valley looked like in 1910, I believe, or in the late 1800s, and then in present day. In and that's start that juxtaposes the two, um, kind of how the valley has been managed. And so before it was a lot of meadow, and today Yosemite is known for these big sublime trees. Um, and sadly, there's a lot of dead trees. um, because of bark beetles and wildfire and bad things that have a lot to do with our inability with fire suppression policy.
So speaking of fire suppression policy, um, you know, focus to I froze. There we go. Sorry about that. So speaking again about the those kinds of issues, I wanted to ask, like, what were some of the what were and are some of the traditional practices related to land stewardship, and how have they been impacted by past and current Western conservation movement?
Yes. So the Western conservation movement um, has not been good for my tribe, generally speaking. Um, Especially in Yosemite, in the Yosemite Valley, how all of the camps are numbered. I think it's Camp 4 that's famous for rock climbing. Um, well, in some of those camps, uh, were Mu- were where Miwok people lived, the Awanichi, the people of Yosemite Valley, and I believe it was in the 1950s that they were forcibly removed. And so we have a lot of elders who were born and lived in the Yosemite Valley um, and were displaced. Um, and even worse is that the Southern Sierra Miwok Nation, they don't have federal recognition, despite there being copious amounts of documentation and essentially proof that they have been there since time immemorial, which is one of the requirements for federal recognition. Um, and so it's a very sad situation. That we see today because of Western conservation. Before they were forcibly removed, there were Yosemite Indian days where um, they were essentially exploited and had to dress up as plains natives. The stereotypical, more like Lakota, you know, with the horses and the braids and headdresses. That is not our way in California. Um, our cultures are very different, and so there's that history of exploitation and forced removal. Um, that and of course our inability to manage the land in the way that it needs, or steward the land in the way that it needs.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and you'd also mentioned fire suppression and those practices, and what did that look like for folks who aren't familiar with that practice now as it's become?
Yeah, so cultural burning, that's um, so cultural burning is a part of how many tribes have stewarded the land for thousands and thousands of years. We do it in California, they do it in Australia, we do it all along the West Coast. Um, and and so I always think, what is the land supposed to look like? And so even looking at Yosemite Valley, how it so there's the meadow, but more of it was meadow. There's more biodiversity, and so I've heard stories of uh, I suppose Miwok people are slightly nomadic. Um, that might look like, oh, just moving, just moving our village from here to there because there's less snow over there, or like it might be like 8 miles away. Nomadism, it's not, I don't think it's what most people imagine it to be. Um and so I've heard stories of like when leaving the valley, kind of just like setting fire behind you as you head out. And this is for fuel reduction, um, and to promote certain plants that may need to be activated by fire in order to regenerate. Um, and cultural burning is generally a it's it can be almost more like a smoldering. It's the reason we have wildfires is because there isn't proper fuel reduction and um, that sort of thing. I'm not an expert on cultural burning, but many of our people, we do have a lot of people who are very knowledgeable in that, um, and there are a lot of efforts to restore it. Um, yeah, so that's a little bit about what cultural burning looks like. It's a low burn, not this what we see with wildfires.
Right. And that is in its at its heart, it's conservation. Like not what this movement and this almost industry has been when people think about conservation and these large organizations, but it is on the ground. It's knowledge of the land, knowledge of the impacts that we have, and how to take care of it on a seasonal, year by year basis, not on a well, I wrote this on a paper, therefore it must somehow translate to reality policy. Um, so we are talking about the Western conservation movement, and I wanted to open it up a little bit. Do you have any feelings on that? Like, what is working and what could and should be done differently? And this is both, you know, your advocate hat and your hat through Sacred Lands Native Hands. Like, I know that you are involved in a lot of these conversations and national monuments and public land expansion and designation and co-management. Like, what are some things that you feel are working within this so-called conservation movement, and what are some things that you would like to see? A lot of us are also in this world, and how can we make that change happen?
Right. One thing I will say is that we work on co-management campaigns, but co-management should not necessarily be co-management. I don't consider that to be land back. I think that it's good for where we are currently, um, because a lot of tribes don't have the capacity to manage that large swaths of land. Um, and so it does help to have the resources, but that is not the ultimate goal. Even though we support co-management. um, so um, your question was, uh, could you ask?
Yeah, what are some things within this Western conservation conversation that are working, and what are some things that you feel could be done better, that need to be done differently and better?
Yes. So something that I think can be done better is, well, honestly, okay, I'm wearing these earrings. I really just think we need to get land back. Um, I think that's kind of the biggest thing. Um, but also I think that in conservation, more of it needs to be indigenous led, tribally led, um, even when supporting tribal interests. Um, I've seen, I think more funding needs to go to native led organizations. I've seen gatekeeping of funding on conservation efforts, um, kind of white led traditional conservation organizations. Um, Almost withholding funding from native led organizations. And if you look at natives in philanthropy, um, such a small amount of philanthropic dollars go toward native led organizations. So I think that's a critical place to start in the conservation movement. Um, yeah, and of course, just supporting tribally led efforts, native led efforts.
I hear you. I hear you. And there are a lot of folks, within our community that sit on coalitions or part of them, and I think absolutely to echo what you're saying, the centering and funding of indigenous and tribal voices and leadership, I think, is crucial to this work that
Yeah.
we're doing, that we all find ourselves a part of. So going back a little bit, talking about the history of forced removal and unratified treaties. How has the history of forced removal and unratified treaties influenced the perspectives on public land use and co-management and co-stewardship among Indigenous peoples today?
Well, to be frank, I think that um, our forced removal, um, unratified treaties, how kind of where Indigenous peoples have fallen in conservation. Um, I think that it has made people think that we're extinct largely. Um, when people go to Yosemite National Park, they're not really thinking like, "Oh, this is indigenous lands. Oh, who are the indigenous peoples of these lands?" That's a very small percentage of the visitorship. Um, there are millions of people who visit Yosemite every year, and so just looking at California as a whole, it's very different from the Southwest or even the Pacific Northwest, where it's apparent that Native peoples are there. Um, um, the like the local tribal culture, parts of like the cultures of the local tribes are everywhere. Even the flag. I believe that that's a design from one of the pueblos. And in California, we don't we don't really see um, we don't really see any of we don't see much of that from we don't see much evidence of the local tribes or local peoples, um, despite I believe it's LA that's the biggest is the most like densely populated city for of natives, um, because of relocation, because of the Indian Relocation Act that brought Native people from reservations to cities to work. And so, despite all and California holding one fifth of federally recognized tribes, we don't see that, and so a place that we often have to start in educating people is that we're still here, that we exist.
And I appreciate you you and so many others taking on that role of the education. The burden should really be on the individuals to learn, and yet you're so gracious with this time and the patience, and definitely appreciate and are grateful for that. Um, so I've got a question. Are there any specific examples or stories from Indigenous history that highlight Western conservation policies?
Um, so this is not really one of our stories, but it's from I wish I could remember the name of the book, but it's a book on pretty much conservation in the Yosemite Valley, and it's there's a quote that has always stuck out to me, and that is this: the Yosemite Indians had two seasons for harvest. One was for acorns, the other was for tourists. Um, and to me, that quote does a good job of highlighting the impacts of Western conservation policies and how, in kind of the role that Indigenous peoples played. It was not necessarily in stewardship, but um, it was more so for exploitation. Um, we were really, because of the creation of the national park, um, the Awanichi, especially, were really exploited. And so that's one part of kind of the ugly history of Western conservation.
Then, there is so much painful history, and I appreciate you sharing that. But I wanted to go back to Sacred Lands, Native Hands, and what what role does Sacred Lands, Native Hands play in these current efforts towards advocacy, towards education, and providing legal services to underserved tribes in the western region of the United States seeking to regain access to their traditional territories?
Yes. So our role is primarily working on the legislative efforts um, for tribes to access land, um, or building working groups uh, for tribes to work together, to make co-management agreements, or those types of efforts. And also, a more recent project that we've started developing is advocating how to advocate for tribal fishing rights, because while in Northern California, they've done a good job of securing their fishing rights. Um, in Around the Sacramento and American River and Cosumnes River, and McCollum, we don't have strong fishing rights, um, and a part of that will be to focus more on restoring the rivers, and working on improving the health of the rivers, and the fish. And yeah, so that's something that we're working on. But yeah, a lot of what we do is legislative. It could be lobbying. And I actually wanted to add something to the last question. um, and so when I was and so how and so in that quote of how Yosemite Indians, the second season was for harvesting tourists. Um, conservation, what conservation has done for indigenous peoples is it's attempted to sever our connection to the land to force us into mainstream society. And so, and even though we're still able to gather acorns and whatnot, we don't, our diets have changed. Our every We have the Native Americans have the highest rates of diabetes, suicides, teen pregnancy, everything that you don't want to have the highest rates of. And I really think that a lot of our issues go back to the land, and so that's why sacred lands, um, we it, it's really um, it's really getting um, tribes access to lands by any means necessary, whether that be land acquisition or co-management or easements, whatever it may be, because the issues that we are faced with are so dire.
I really appreciate you sharing that, and I think that leads us into our final question, which is, we have these situations and we have this reality that has been impacted by this traditional Western conservation and version of public lands. Um, so how can how do organizations like Latino Outdoors, how do community members and advocates like within our broad network, and so many others, how can we work together to help support the various advocacy efforts across the nation? How can we help support your work through Sacred Lands Native Hands?
Absolutely. Well, things like this. Thank you so much to Latino Outdoors for sharing your platform to amplify our work. The issues that we're working on, um, and kind of bringing light to conservation. Because, even though I say all of these things about Western conservation, um, ultimately, what we're trying to do is improve conservation. Uh, and work with conservation organizations, um, so that it isn't something that is destructive um, toward us, but something that we are. This I think that conservation is something that Indigenous peoples need to be a part of, um, and in positions of influence. Um, in meaningful positions. Um, and so I think that's an important way that conservation organizations like Latino Outdoors can support our work. Oh, I can't hear you.
Let me try that again. I appreciate your work, Carissa. I appreciate everything you do and what Sacred Lands Native Hands does. Like I said, I know there are so many more advocacy efforts and rematriation and indigenous ecological knowledge movements that are happening, and we're just honored to be able to share this space with you, and really thank you for taking the time and the patience to explain so many of these concepts and so many of these important stories with myself and with the rest of Latino Outdoors in our community. Um, I wrote something earlier today, which was, I think it's pretty applicable, which is we may not have all the answers, but we will challenge ourselves to grow. And as we expand our understandings, we encourage you all to follow and to join us on this journey as we gain insight, knowledge, and hopefully a little bit of wisdom. So with that, Caressa, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for everything that it is that you do. Thank you again for sharing your knowledge and your gift of advocacy with all of us here at Latino Outdoors. And please, for anybody who's listening and following, go check out sacredlandsnativehands.org and follow them on Instagram and on other social media platforms. Again, thank you so much, Caressa. Have a beautiful day, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Kamo.